Hello, my friend. Tonight we're stepping back into the Middle Ages, but not the kind with dragons or fairy tales. You'll become Eleanor of Aquitaine, not just a queen, but a woman sharp as a blade, cleverer than most men dared admit, and trapped in a world that expected her to smile while bleeding. You'll walk the corridors of a royal court where power and perfume tried to hide everything raw. The filth, the politics, the childbirth, the loneliness, the smell of unwashed velvet. No textbooks will show you this life. But tonight you'll live it from the inside. So before we begin, dim the lights. Let the fan hum gently beside you. Pull the blanket over your shoulders like a velvet cape if that brings you comfort. And if you're listening from New York or Da Nang, Berlin, or a quiet bus ride somewhere, leave a little comment. I'd love to know where this story finds you. It means something knowing Eleanor's voice still travels. If this tale brings you peace or company or even just a quiet smile, subscribe only if it feels right. Now then, let's return to the court. Queen Eleanor is waiting. So yes, my name is Eleanor. And not just any Eleanor. That Eleanor, Duchess of Aquitaine, Queen of France, Queen of England. Twice married, twice crowned, and endlessly misunderstood. Sounds impressive, doesn't it? But between you and me, what I remember most, what lingers even now, is walking barefoot through the vineyards as a girl, dust between my toes and not needing anyone's permission to be exactly where I was. When I was just a duchess, I could bathe when I pleased. Dip into a warm basin with herbs and orange peel just because I wanted to feel human again. But once I became queen, I had to ask a priest for permission to wear lavender oil. Yes, truly. Even the scent on my wrist had to be spiritually modest. People imagine royalty as reclining on silk cushions, grapes in one hand, a lute playing softly in the distance. In reality, you're sweating through 4 layers of brocade, perched on a throne that feels more like a butcher's slab, trying not to faint from heat or hunger or head lice. Oh yes, the lice. We'll get to them. Don't worry, they always come back. I had everything A-crown so heavy it left a dent in my scalp. Gown so stiff with gold thread I couldn't lift my arms above my waist. A schedule that started with mass and ended with migraines. Smile when expected. Be silent when you'd rather scream. Sit up straight while your spine begs for mercy. And above all, never yawn. Queens don't get tired. We radiate divine composure. Apparently, my chambers were grand, of course. Carved wooden bed velvet curtains, tapestries that smelled like old incense. One tiny window blessedly barred to keep the devils out. And candles. Always candles. Not for ambiance. To keep the rats off my feet. Think I'm being dramatic. One night I woke up to scratching under my pillow. 2 rats were fighting over a piece of communion bread I'd hidden. Yes, hidden. Not for piety, but for leverage. I was hoping that if I offered it back in the morning, I could avoid yet another lecture about the spiritual geometry of barley. Freedom in a palace. It's the most expensive thing you'll never own. I couldn't so much as step into the corridor without an entourage. 2 handmaids, a priest, and a list of nobles who were allowed to make eye contact without being accused of heresy. Sometimes I think about little Eleanor, the version of me who used to sneak off to the stables, just to hear soldiers gossip about war and women. Now, if I make a clever remark over dinner, some monk scribbles it down like I've just insulted the Holy Trinity. Royal privilege sounds lovely on parchment, but in truth, it's a polished cage, maintained daily with obligation performance and silence. I'm Eleanor, and let me tell you this, you may not starve in a palace, but you will definitely itch. You ever try sitting still for 3 hours straight? Not in yoga pants, not on a plush armchair with a cup of wine. I mean sitting bolt upright in a 30-pound dress, balancing a 15-pound crown on a rock-solid chair that was designed by a monk who clearly hated backsides. Yeah, that was my Tuesday. To the outside world, a throne is the ultimate symbol of power. To me, it was a medieval torture device with a backrest. Carved from oak designed for a man twice my size and half my flexibility, and positioned just high enough that your feet dangle unless you sit just right. And God forbid you sit wrong. A crooked angle could spark rumors about anything from scoliosis to secret pregnancies. So I sat perfectly straight, always. I had to layer 4 velvet cushions underneath me, 1 sheep pelt over the top, and tilt my pelvis like I was trying to win a posture contest no one wanted to be in. Meanwhile, the courtiers watched. They always watched. 12 pairs of eyes analyzing every blink, every breath, every bead of sweat like I was a walking omen. Once I scratched my nose during a sermon, and within a day there was a rumor I was signaling French spies. Another time I yawned one small yawn during a particularly long reading from the book of Psalms. That same evening I was told I might be under demonic influence and was strongly encouraged to fast for 3 days. Which I did. On broth made from boiled onions and regret. And the crown. It doesn't sit on your head. It grinds into your scalp. One wrong tilt and it shifts just enough to give you a pounding headache for the rest of the day. Once I tried taking it off quietly during a banquet, people thought I was signaling the beginning of a war. But my favorite moment, truly unforgettable, was after a particularly grueling ceremony. I had been sitting upright, silent, smiling politely for 4.5 hours. My back hurt. My legs were numb. And this young noblewoman floated over in her silk and smugness and said, "Your Majesty, I admire your poise. You look so serene." Serene. Girl! I had a cramp in my left rib, 3 lice bites under my neckline, and a bladder situation I won't even get into. But sure, serene. That's the job. Sit, smile, suffer, and make it look holy. Being queen isn't about sitting on a throne. It's about sitting through everything else, the nonsense, the politics, the hymns, the whispers, the heat rash, and doing it without twitching. The throne may be carved from royal wood, but honey, it never fits quite right. Let's talk about bathing. Or, as it's more accurately known in the 12th century, boiling a cow's worth of water to sit in for 6 minutes before someone barges in and ruins it. Now don't get me wrong, I liked being clean. I even enjoyed a soak when I could get one. Back in Aquitaine, we had proper bathhouses, heated water, lavender oil, the occasional minstrel humming in the corner. It was borderline spa day. Then I became Queen of France, and suddenly taking a bath became a logistical operation more complicated than a crusade. First, you had to request a bath. Yes, request. And if it wasn't Sunday, a holy day, or you hadn't just given birth, you might get side-eyed for being too indulgent. God forbid you want to scrub your armpits more than once a fortnight. That might make you look vain. Then came the water. It took 8 servants to haul enough buckets to fill the wooden tub, which leaked by the way, and another 4 to heat it with logs from the royal woods. So now your bath is not just a hygiene matter, it's a budget line item on the kingdom's fuel expense. And you'd better soak fast, because the longer you sit in it, the colder it gets. And once it gets cold, the smell of old waterwood and your own regret starts rising. Not exactly what I'd call refreshing. Oh, and privacy? Forget it. There's always a maid hovering with rose petals, another one holding a towel, and a third reciting something from the Book of Judith. Just in case Satan decided to possess you mid-scrub. You ever try shaving your legs while a nun prays over your shoulder? Didn't think so. Now let's talk about what happens when you don't get to bathe. You sweat. Constantly. Under layers of wool, silk, fur-lined everything. You smell like a barn after Easter Mass, and so does everyone else. But here's the trick, you're not supposed to admit it. Instead, you dab yourself with vinegar-soaked cloths. You carry a pomander, a fancy little ball filled with herbs and dried flowers, and you wave it in front of your nose like that's going to erase the fact that your underarms are fermenting. And of course, there's perfume. Mine was made from crushed violets, deer musk, and something called angel's breath, which I'm 90% sure was just fermented sheep sweat in a fancy bottle. Did it work? Not really. Did it make me smell rich? Absolutely. Just not clean. Once I went 2 whole weeks without a proper bath because the bishop said it was inappropriate during Lent. By day 10, my ladies-in-waiting were trying to discreetly stuff cloves into the seams of my gown. By day 12, I was seriously considering jumping in the moat. Being queen means looking radiant while slowly marinating in your own discomfort. So yes, I bathed. Just not often, and never alone, and rarely for fun. Let's not beat around the haystack. If you were alive in the Middle Ages, you had lice. Period. And I don't care if you were a peasant or a queen, those little creatures didn't care about your bloodline. In fact, I think they preferred royalty. All that heavy velvet, those 12 layers of brocade and fur. That's not fashion, that's prime real estate for insects. As queen, I was supposed to be the picture of elegance. But underneath that embroidered gown, a battlefield. I remember the first time I felt it a tickle at the back of my neck. I thought it was a stray thread. Then another. Then another. By the third day, I realized my scalp had been turned into a 5-star resort for freeloading parasites. Now there were solutions. We had louse combs, of course. Wooden or bone with teeth so fine you could use them to file down a felony. But combing didn't just take time, it took strategy. Because once you started, they scattered. You needed help. 2 ladies in waiting, one to comb, one to hold the torch, and you sat there like a disgraced statue while they inspected your head like it was a crime scene. And the smell. We used vinegar. Not the cute balsamic drizzle you put on salad. I'm talking sharp medieval vinegar that could peel paint off a monastery wall. Mix that with crushed garlic throw and a little rosemary, and you had the 12th century equivalent of lice napalm. We rubbed it in, let it sit. Covered our heads with linen. Waited and waited. And still a week later, someone would find a straggler crawling across my collar like it owned the place. Sometimes I wondered if the lice weren't just bugs, but tiny nobles holding a court of their own. Even worse, people talked about lice like it was a moral failing. Oh, the queen's got lice again, no wonder the crops failed. Yes, apparently my itchy scalp had a direct connection to divine punishment and agricultural output. I tried everything. Lavender sachets, ash dust, burning my veils, but they always came back because everyone had them. Even the bishops, even the king. But no one dared say that out loud. So I smiled. I waved. I held my chin high. All while something tiny and relentless built a nest behind my ear. You think royal life is glamorous? Try surviving lice in a corset and a public reputation to uphold. Here's the thing about the Middle Ages. Everything smelled. And I don't mean a little ripe or farmhouse chic, I mean bad. Unholy. Like soup left in the sun next to a dying goat. And you know what's worse? No one talked about it. We all just floated around politely pretending that we weren't marinating in our own sweat meat grease candle smoke and horse dung. I once walked into a cathedral during Lent full of nobles clergy monks and nearly passed out from the combined scent of unwashed tunics, incense, old fish, and piety. It was like a religious gas chamber. Let's be clear, we didn't have deodorant. We had ideas about deodorant. Most of them involved smashing flowers into a paste or rubbing animal fat mixed with crushed mint under our arms. I tried both. Neither worked. The flowers wilted and the mint just made me smell like a festive roast. Now as a queen, I had access to perfumes. Fancy ones. But back then, perfume was basically alcohol-dried petals and disappointment. One of my favorite bottles included notes of violet ambergris and essence of civet, which is a polite way of saying cat anus. And you had to reapply constantly because the moment you stepped into the throne room, boom, the heat, the bodies, the sweat, the fabric, all of it made sure that within minutes you smelled like a very wealthy corpse. The men, no better. In fact, much worse. Chainmail traps heat like a cast iron skillet. And when you have a room full of knights fresh from a training session, all puffed up on pride and body odor, let's just say no amount of incense could save you. Even my husband Henry, lovely man, decent ruler, smelled like a wet dog dipped in mead by midday. I still loved him. But I also positioned myself strategically downwind. And yet, we all pretended. We powdered our wigs. We passed around fragrant gloves. I once saw a lady of the court faint not from the heat, but from the sheer stench of the man next to her. She blamed it on holy emotion. We all nodded. We all knew. Smell was a part of life. It clung to walls, to curtains, to prayers, to kings. We didn't fight it. We just learned to live inside it. Royal life didn't smell like roses. It smelled like roses that died in a wine barrel and were never properly buried. People think queens sleep on clouds. Featherbed silk sheets, a warm fire crackling nearby right. Wrong. Let me describe my royal bedtime routine. First, I climb into a bed the size of a ship. Sounds luxurious until you realize it's carved from solid wood and squeaks like it's haunted. I have to hoist myself up using a stool because someone in the 1100s thought bed height should equal horse saddle. Then there are the sheets. Linen sure but stiff enough to exfoliate your shins. And the mattress stuffed with straw. That's right, actual scratchy, rustling straw. So every time you shift your weight, the bed whispers secrets like, "You're not royalty, you're livestock." Now for the fun part, the cold. Castles aren't cozy. They're stone boxes with wind tunnels for hallways. My chamber has a fireplace, but half the heat goes straight up the chimney and out to entertain the birds. And don't get me started on the windows, they're just holes with attitude. Glass, please. That's a luxury for cathedrals. So every night I'm bundled in 3 blankets, 2 cloaks, and sometimes a fur-trimmed hood. I look less like a queen and more like a suspiciously overdressed squirrel preparing for hibernation. And just as I start to doze off, scratch, scratch, that's not a dream. That's a rat. Or 2. Maybe 3. Welcome to Chateau de Rodentia, Your Majesty. Sometimes they fight. Sometimes they scurry over my shoes. Once I swear one sat on the edge of my bed like it had questions about tax reform. Oh, and don't forget the bells. At midnight, the monks ring them. At 3 a.m., they ring them again. Just in case you forgot God exists between REM cycles. And if you do manage to fall asleep, don't worry. Someone will burst in at dawn to recite scripture in Latin with all the soothing energy of a goat giving birth. In short, sleep was less of a restorative experience and more of a medieval endurance sport. Still think royal life was glamorous. I slept in a drafty barn disguised as a palace, while rodents held nightly conferences at my bedside and my bladder begged for permission to survive another cold morning. But sure, call me your grace. Here's the thing about medieval banquets, they sound fancy, but mostly they were long, loud, uncomfortable, and occasionally dangerous. As queen, I was expected to grace the table with poise and restraint, while being served an all-you-can-endure buffet of roasted everything. Pigeon, boar, swan. Once I think someone brought in a hedgehog molded out of fish. Just to impress the bishop. And the food. Oh, it was seasoned with enough cloves and cinnamon to spice a whole continent. Not because we liked flavor, because we were hiding something. Like rot. Meat wasn't always fresh. Fresh meant it had only been dead for 2 days. Maybe 3. As long as it wasn't green and still wiggling, it was apparently good enough for royalty. That's where the spices came in, masking the crime scene. And don't get me started on portion size. A proper feast could go on for 6 hours with 12 courses. That's not dinner, that's culinary warfare. You're in a corset seated bolt upright on a wooden bench, while someone dumps a slab of meat in front of you the size of your forearm. And remember, I wasn't allowed to eat like a normal human. No fingers, no slouching, no ugly chewing. Every bite had to be delicate, graceful. Basically a performance. I once choked on a peppered pear while trying to nod and look majestic at the same time. It gets worse. You couldn't ask questions like, "What is this?" because that might offend the cook. Or worse, the Lord, who imported it from some corner of Christendom where diseases are born. And digestion, forget it. By midnight, you're hunched over in your chamber, clutching your stomach, and trying to remember whether that swan pâté was supposed to taste a little metallic. Spoiler, it wasn't. I once spent an entire night on the floor after a banquet in Normandy. The goose had been optimistic. By dawn, my ladies were lighting incense and debating whether I had food poisoning or divine punishment. To be fair, sometimes it was divine punishment, but usually it was just bad fish disguised with raisins. Look, I get it. Feasts were political. Every roasted beast was a symbol, every course a flex. But after a few too many banquets, you start dreaming of a warm bowl of plain lentils and a meal where nothing stares back at you. Still, I smiled. I toasted. I performed the sacred duty of eating with dignity while secretly praying I wouldn't vomit in front of the archbishop. Being queen didn't mean you ate better. It meant you ate bigger, longer, and with an audience. Let me say this loud and clear. Being a queen meant never dressing yourself. Not because I was lazy, far from it. I could ride a horse, write a letter, and run a duchy before breakfast. But putting on clothes that required a small army and the patience of a saint. It started with the underlayers. Linen chemise, wool stockings, laced petticoats. You ever tried wrestling yourself into 10 pounds of itchy fabric while someone's praying over your head? Welcome to my mornings. Then came the corset. Or as I like to call it, the vice of virtue. It had to be tight enough to flatten sin, but loose enough for me to speak. Just barely. My ladies-in-waiting would pull the laces while I held onto a bedpost and tried not to pass out. A daily act of devotion, really. Next came the gowns, plural. One for warmth, one for formality, one to match the rug in the Great Hall, apparently. Each gown weighed at least 15 pounds and had sleeves long enough to trip a small dog. And they weren't just for show. Oh no, they were coded messages. Dark blue humility, crimson authority, gold thread. I'm wealthier than you, and yes, this hurts. Then the hair. Ladies, let me explain something. If you've never had your scalp braided so tight, you could hear your ancestors scream you've never experienced medieval beauty standards. They used bone combs, scented oils, and hot irons hot to curl and pin every strand. Once my braid caught fire near a candle, I didn't flinch. I just looked at the maid and said, well, that's one way to add highlights. Shoes decorative only. Most were so narrow they made your feet look dainty by breaking your toes. I had a pair made of velvet and wood so stiff I could have used them as weapons. Jewelry was the finishing touch. But forget modern elegance, we're talking chokers that choked crowns that dug into your scalp, and rings big enough to anchor a ship. One time I lost circulation in my hand at a banquet and waved it off like, royal things. And just when you thought you were done, you had to do it all again at dinner. Different outfit, different symbolism, different corset that somehow hurts in a new and exciting place. So no, getting dressed wasn't a task. It was a ritual, a statement, a slow descent into fabulous discomfort. I didn't just wear clothes, I wore messages. I wore expectations. I wore proof that a queen could suffer with style. If you think royal court was a glamorous parade of jewels and polite conversation, bless your heart. Court was a stage. And every single person from bishops to stable boys was an actor. Only the play was long boring, and everyone secretly hated each other. We'd gather in the great hall draped in velvet and powdered and crushed herbs, trying not to sweat through 3 layers of nobility. There'd be music, sure. Maybe a troubadour singing about doomed lovers, or a knight who killed a dragon and cried about it afterward. But no one was listening. Everyone was watching. Watching who sat where, who bowed first, who whispered to whom. One wrong look and suddenly the whole room thinks you're planning a coup with the kitchen maid. And smiling. Oh, you had to smile. Even when your corset was slicing you in half and someone next to you smelled like bad cheese and betrayal. I once smiled for so long my cheek twitched for 2 hours afterward. But heaven forbid you frown, because that meant scandal, pregnancy, or heresy. Possibly all 3. Conversations were torture. You couldn't say anything real. Just endless loops of how lovely your tunic is. Oh, your lordship's falcon was so majestic yesterday. Isn't the weather just divinely obedient today? And behind each comment, a hidden jab. Lovely tunic meant you spent too much money. Majestic falcon meant we all saw it miss the rabbit. Obedient weather, I hope your crops fail. And heaven help you if you laughed at the wrong moment. I once chuckled at a joke about a bishop's wig. For a week, no one spoke to me without clutching a rosary. I had to write an apology letter to a hat. The court was political theater in tight clothing and worse lighting. Every gesture was a message. Every silence a warning. Every compliment a trap wrapped in silk. And yet I played the part. I curtsied. I nodded. I raised my goblet and toasted people I'd rather see trip into the moat. Because that's what queens do. We sit through the performance. And we do it in heels. People love to imagine royal romance as some sweeping candlelit affair. Silk sheets, flirtatious glances across the feast table, secret kisses in the garden. No, try obligation awkwardness and the distinct scent of goat cheese sweat. Here's the reality, royal marriages were contracts with crowns on top. Henry and I weren't soulmates, we were strategic assets. I was young, politically valuable, and inconveniently opinionated. He was ambitious, irritable, and smelled vaguely like a wet fireplace. Romance, please. There was a schedule. Yes, an actual schedule approved by clergy for when and how often we should unite for the good of the realm. It was written in Latin just in case you wanted your sex life to feel extra spiritual and profoundly unsexy. We did it out of duty, sometimes out of curiosity, occasionally out of mild affection, mostly because a steward outside the door was tracking productive nights. The beds were squeaky, the room was drafty, the candles sputtered like they were judging us, and the whole time you're thinking, is this how future monarchs are made? Yes, apparently. Privacy was optional, so was pleasure. And don't even get me started on the aftermath. The questioning stares, the whispered prayers, the linen inspections, like we just completed a sacred ritual and not, human biology. And if I ever said no, that made me a sinner, a bad wife, a threat to the royal bloodline, because God forbid a queen wants some space and a hot drink instead of a royal performance under pressure. Of course I played along. I smiled. I bore children. I fulfilled my sacred feminine duty. But love came in brief moments. Between politics, between pregnancies, and the quiet glances when no one else was watching. Henry wasn't a bad man. He was just medieval. Raised on swords and scripture and the belief that a woman's silence was her virtue. But I was never very quiet, and I was never just his. If you've ever imagined medieval childbirth as a glowing candlelit miracle, let me stop you right there. Try a wooden birthing chair. Boiling water no one actually uses. A priest pacing outside the door. And the overwhelming sense that half the people in the room are more worried about your soul than your cervix. Let's start with the chair. It wasn't a bed. Oh no, beds were for the dead. Labor happened on a carved wooden chair with a giant hole in the middle and 2 handles you could grip while screaming your ancestral lineage into the ceiling. Pain relief laughs in Latin. We had herbs, sometimes wine, but mostly we had women. Mothers, midwives, wet nurses, all yelling over each other with advice like, breathe deep. Don't breathe too much. Push like St. Margaret is watching. Meanwhile, the priest is outside praying for my safe passage into either heaven or motherhood, whichever came first. And of course, there's the crown. Not the one on my head. The baby's crown. The moment the midwife yells, I see the head, and suddenly everyone starts weeping and crossing themselves like I just summoned the second coming. Let me be clear, it was bloody. It was loud. It was terrifying. And that's if things went well. If they didn't, you bled. You tore. You died. Or worse, the baby died and you lived, and then you spent the rest of your royal life being told it was God's punishment for pride or fasting on a Tuesday. I gave birth 10 times. 10. And each time the room was packed with more worry than warmth. People whispered prayers, not comfort. Every breath I took was a risk, every silence a sign. I wasn't a mother, yet I was a walking vessel of dynasty. And if the child lived... Congratulations now. Hand them to a wet nurse and go sit through Mass while your body feels like it's been ripped apart by divine intention. Was there joy? Yes, but it was buried under blood, sweat, incense, and centuries of expectation. So no childbirth wasn't magical. It was medieval. You'd think that after surviving childbirth, a queen might get a moment to breathe. Ha! No, you're not a woman, you're a symbol. And symbols don't get rest. After giving birth, I wasn't ushered into comfort. I was led into confinement. 40 days. Minimum. Locked away in a cold stone chamber with no visitors except priests, midwives, and the occasional pigeon that slipped in through the window slit. They called it churching. I called it being exiled while bleeding from places people refused to name out loud. The idea was that I needed purification. Because apparently giving life meant I'd become spiritually dirty. So I sat in silence, wrapped in wool, dripping, aching, mourning things I wasn't allowed to grieve. If the baby lived, they took it away, immediately handed to wet nurses wrapped in cloth, whisked to the nursery like I was just the delivery service, not the mother. If the baby didn't live, silence. No ceremony, no holding. Just a priest, a candle, and a quiet implication that God has his reasons. I cried. Not openly, of course. Queens don't do that. I wept into linens, into pillows, into empty sleeves. And when I bled too much, they blamed my sins. When I bled too little, they blamed my womb. My body had just built a human being from scratch, and yet somehow it was still seen as a failure or worse, a scandal. And let's not forget the superstitions. I wasn't allowed to step outside before being blessed. Wasn't allowed to touch iron. Was told that if I looked in a mirror, I might reflect death back into the child. Yes, really. Meanwhile, my back ached, my breasts leaked, and every seat in the castle felt like punishment. But I smiled when the nobles came to visit. I bowed my head when the priest gave thanks. I nodded gracefully when someone whispered, "You're strong, your grace." No, I wasn't strong. I was wounded and exhausted in a gown that still smelled of sweat and smoke. But in the Middle Ages, that was the job: bleed quietly, smile politely, and always make sure the heir survives. Faith was everywhere, carved into walls, etched into rings, sewn into the hem of every gown I wore. I couldn't take a single step, not through a hallway, not across a courtyard, not even toward my own child, without stepping through some invisible fog of guilt, reverence, and whispered judgment. God, they said, watched everything, which meant I never truly walked alone. I was followed by saints' shadows and suspicious glances. I prayed, of course. Twice before sunrise. Once before I ate. Anytime anything went wrong, which as queen meant constantly. But my prayers were quiet. Not because I lacked devotion, but because everything I really wanted to say felt like heresy. I wanted to ask why children died. Why women bled. Why prayers went unanswered while tyrants kept winning wars and bishops kept building bigger palaces. But you don't ask those things not out loud. Not if you want to stay on the throne. So we did what queens do. We performed piety like theater. We kissed relics, donated churches, fasted during festivals, smiled during sermons that blamed Eve for every terrible thing since the apple. But in the quiet hours behind closed chapel doors, I wrestled with something else. Not God, but the idea of him. The way men used him to punish, to silence, to shame. A man could slaughter peasants and be blessed for it. I questioned a tax policy and suddenly I'm a threat to divine order. And so I wore my faith like a cloak. Visible, elegant, respectable. But underneath torn seams. And unanswered prayers. Dear me, the younger me. The barefoot girl racing through vineyards, wild-haired, loud-laughed, too curious for her own safety. You wanted everything. And in a way you got it. The crown, the courts, the alliances, the gowns, the applause. You got the poems written for you. The legends etched in stained glass. The world bowed to you, sort of. But let me tell you what else you'll get. You'll get stared at constantly. Judged not for who you are, but for what you symbolize. You'll be told to be quiet for peace. To dress modestly for respect. To bear children for legacy. To smile for the realm. And you will do it. You'll survive kings, crusades, betrayal, childbirth. You'll outlive lovers and rumors and the sound of your own name being dragged through court corridors. But you'll lose things too. Your voice some days, your body piece by piece. The right to grief in public. The right to be angry without being punished. You'll be locked in a tower by the man you once held hands with in gardens. You'll eat alone. Pray alone. And sometimes be forgotten entirely. But listen to me now. You will still write. You will still rule. You will plant ideas that outlive empires. You will raise sons who will rule not just kingdoms but stories. And in quiet moments just before dawn or while brushing your hair with shaking hands, you'll still be that girl. The one who asked too many questions. The one who wanted everything. I didn't forget you. I became you. And I carried you even when no one else could see. Love your older self. Your queen, your witness. People remember the crown. They remember the marriages, the wars, the sons, the scandals. They remember my name Eleanor carved into chronicles, sung in ballads, whispered in sermons about difficult women. But do they remember me? The girl who rode horses without a saddle. The woman who read Latin by candlelight and negotiated with kings like they were merchants at market. The mother who wept over cradles and coffins, often in the same year. History trims the edges. It files down the noise. It takes your jagged life and smooths it into a timeline, neat, forgettable, distant. But I was not neat, and I was never forgettable. I loved men who disappointed me. I raised sons who betrayed me. I ruled kingdoms that feared me. And I endured churches that tried to erase me. I was queen. But I was also prisoner. I was mother, widow, rival, and rumor. I was the reason a crown changed hands, and the excuse when things fell apart. But through it all, the births, the blood, the banquets, the betrayals, I stayed. I watched empires shift beneath my feet. I watched my children turn into kings and my lovers turn into ghosts. I outlived enemies, allies, and almost everything else. And still I'm here. Not in marble, not in stained glass, but in every woman who asks too many questions, who takes up too much space, who wears her ambition like armor, and who refuses to be quiet when quiet is all that's asked of her. So when you hear my name, don't just remember the queen. Remember the woman, because I was many things. And above all, I was never gone. If you think medieval noblewomen spent their days sipping wine, embroidering curtains, and gently sighing at windowsills, you haven't met Jeanne de Clisson, or as history eventually called her, the Lioness of Brittany. Now that name might sound majestic, fierce even, but no one earns a title like that for looking good on horseback. You get it when the kingdom takes everything from you, and you decide to take something back. Jeanne was born into privilege. The kind of upbringing where priests bowed before breakfast and your wine had a family crest. She married twice. First husband died young. Second one was Olivier de Clisson. Strong hands, quiet temper. Not a fan of royal games, which as it turns out made him dangerous. They had children, 5 actually. The kind of family you protect at all costs, especially when the court starts sniffing around. And then came the letter. Olivier was summoned to Paris. Routine questioning, they said. Just a few concerns about some military losses. He promised to be home by week's end. He wasn't. What came home instead was his head. Boxed. Salted. Nailed to the gates of Nantes, not by criminals, but by the crown. No trial, no explanation, just royal justice, quiet, brutal final. Now here's where most stories about noble women end. Tears may be a discreet retreat to a convent. Not Jeanne. What followed next was not grief. It was something colder, sharper. She didn't break down. She broke ranks. She dropped the lace and the lineage. Dropped the title. Dropped the silence. She didn't just mourn her husband. She made a list. A real one. Names, ships, ports, targets. Because this story, it doesn't end with a widow at a funeral. It begins with a mother sharpening her fury. If this were a movie, that scene, the moment she puts the last candle out in her prayer room and walks into the dark, would be where the score drops. Because from this moment forward, Jeanne de Clisson stopped being a lady of the court and became a storm in black sails. Every great revenge story has a turning point. For Jeanne de Clisson, it wasn't the moment her husband was taken. It wasn't even the letter from Paris, cold and formal, asking him to clarify matters of loyalty. No, the turning point was a wooden box. Inside was Olivier's head pickled, sealed, and delivered like some royal invoice. The French crown didn't even bother with ceremony. They just nailed it to the city gate of Nantes. That's how Jeanne found out her husband was dead. Not through a messenger, not through a priest, but by walking through the city and seeing his eyes lifeless, glassy, staring back at her from a wall. If this were a movie, this scene would be shot in silence. No dramatic strings. Just the sound of market chatter fading as Jeanne turns, sees the spike, and realizes what's nailed to it. There's no record of what she said. Some historians claim she collapsed. Others say she stood still, then turned around and walked home without a word. The truth, we'll never know. But what we do know is this. She didn't scream. She didn't faint. She didn't pray. She remembered. And from that moment on, the woman who used to arrange flowers for Sunday Mass started arranging something else entirely. Vengeance. The nobility whispered that she'd lost her mind. But no, Jeanne hadn't lost her mind. She'd lost her patience, her faith, her tolerance for crowns that played judge and executioner in secret. She stopped attending court, stopped entertaining, stopped pretending her sons would grow up safe if she just kept quiet. That's the terrifying thing about women like Jeanne. They don't start wars the way men do with drums and declarations. They do it the slow way, the smart way, the way that waits until the crown's not looking. And then they strike. What the French monarchy didn't know was that they hadn't silenced a widow. They had created something, and she was just getting started. This is the part of the movie where the camera pans over a stormy harbor. Jeanne stands on the dock no longer in morning black, but in something sharper. Her face is calm, her eyes focused. The soft noblewoman has vanished. Because when the crown takes everything from you and the church tells you to forgive, and your friends quietly disappear, you don't light candles. You light torches. And Jeanne, she sold it all. The estates, the jewels, every silk gown stitched for court, even the heirlooms passed down by generations of obedient women. She stripped her life bare down to the bones and used every coin to build something the French crown would never see coming. 3 warships. Not carriages, not convents. Ships! She had them painted completely black. No royal crests, no family sigils. Just black wood, black sails, and a red flag that didn't stand for any nation. It stood for revenge. She didn't recruit knights or noble warriors. She recruited men with scars, disgraced soldiers, hungry mercenaries, sailors who had nothing to lose and everything to burn. They didn't call her captain. They called her Lady Hell, because she paid in gold but made them swear in blood. Her sons came with her. Not all one was too young. But her eldest, Olivier Jr., stood by her side as she watched her first ship leave the harbor. If this was a scene, you'd hear the creak of the ropes, the groan of timber, and Jeanne's voice cutting through it all. We do not pray for peace, we hunt those who stole it. And just like that, Brittany's noble widow became a ghost story. Because the French coast was no longer safe. Not for royal ships, not for noble cargo, not for anyone wearing the wrong flag. If you thought Jeanne was bluffing, you'd be dead by now. Her black ships didn't just cruise the coast, they haunted it. They called it the Black Fleet. 3 vessels quiet as shadow, fast as judgment. They didn't dock at ports, they waited offshore, watching, listening, choosing. Because Jeanne wasn't just attacking the French Navy. She was hunting something more personal. Names. Every noble merchant or official tied to Olivier's execution was added to her ledger. Not for trial, not for ransom, but for destruction. The red flag didn't ask for mercy, and Jeanne didn't offer it. She didn't just sink ships, she boarded them. Steal first, questions never. If this were a movie, you'd see it like this. A calm sea at dusk. A French vessel returning from trade. Suddenly silence breaks. Out of the mist, 3 ships black as morning cloth closing in. No herald, no warning, no survivors. The crew would try to fight. They always did. But Jeanne's men weren't fighting for glory. They were fighting like orphans, like widows, like people with nothing left to lose. And that's the kind of crew that never blinks when the order comes to burn it all. They say Jeanne watched from the deck cloak, whipping in the wind, hand on sword, silent, steady, and exacting. She never smiled. This wasn't about joy. This was about balance. For every head that rolled without justice, she sent a mass to the bottom of the sea. For every royal lie, she left behind smoke on the horizon. And slowly word spread. Sailors began calling her fleet something else. La flotte de la vengeance, the fleet of vengeance. Because it wasn't piracy, it was a message. And everyone from Brittany to Bordeaux was finally starting to read it. Now you'd think the French crown would panic. 3 black ships circling their waters. Noble blood spilled on their own trade routes. A widow with a war fleet and nothing left to lose. Surely the king would rally an armada. Surely Paris would thunder with decrees and gallows and vengeance. But here's the twist, they said nothing. Not a word, not a proclamation, not even a whisper of blame. Because silence, you see, is how royalty hides a mistake. The death of Olivier de Clisson had been a political theater. A message swift and brutal to frighten others into obedience. But Jeanne had flipped the script. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't begging. She was burning ships. And the crown, it did what all-powerful cowards do when the curtain slips. It pretended nothing was wrong. If this were a film, this is the part where we cut to the royal court. Golden hallways, velvet robes. A bored king swirling wine as his ministers shuffle nervously. Sire, there are rumors. Rumors are for peasants. We have diplomacy. Diplomacy. Jeanne was out at sea dismantling it plank by plank. And the nobles, they grew nervous. Because if the king could have Olivier executed without trial, and if his widow could come back as a phantom of revenge, then the entire illusion of control was cracking. Even worse, Jeanne was winning hearts. Fishermen fed her crew in secret. Villagers along the coast whispered prayers not to the church, but to the Black Fleet. Not everyone feared her. Some cheered, because Jeanne wasn't just avenging her husband. She was avenging every broken oath, every peasant taxed into starvation, every lie dressed in silk. She had become something more dangerous than a rebel. She had become a symbol, and symbols once lit are hard to put out. Not every story Jeanne left behind was written in blood. Some were written in silence. Because while Jeanne was carving her vengeance across the channel, someone else was watching, learning. Her son, Olivier Jr. Most pirate stories don't feature children, but this one does. Because Jeanne didn't lock her grief in a tower. She brought it to sea, and her son grew up with the scent of salt fire and retribution. Imagine it, a boy standing barefoot on the deck of a ship. His hands too small to lift a sword, but old enough to remember his father's face. And what the king did to it. He didn't cry. Jean wouldn't have stopped him if he did, but he didn't. Instead, he watched. He listened. And every time a French vessel went up in flames, that boy learned a lesson not taught in noble halls. Power, his mother told him once, is not inherited. It's built plank by plank in the wreckage of what they tried to take from you. And she meant it. Because Jean wasn't raising a prince. She was forging something harder. A survivor. He saw what loyalty cost. What silence cost more. He saw how his mother never begged, only prepared. Never asked, only acted. And the sea became his education. There were no tutors on the Black Fleet. Only sailors with scarred knuckles and a mother who taught him to read wind before he read scripture. And as the boy grew, so did the shadow behind him. People began to whisper not just about Jean, but about her son. Because the boy who watched the sea burn, one day he'd walk into a war of his own. But that's a story for later. Right now, in this moment, aboard a ship painted black, under a sky full of smoke, he is just a boy. But soon he won't be. Every legend has its limit. Even vengeance. For 5 years, the Black Fleet roamed the sea like a ghost with a grudge. French captains whispered Jean's name like it was a curse. Children were told, behave or the lioness will come. And sometimes she did. She stormed galleons. She burned convoys. She vanished into fog before the king could even say her name out loud. But here's the thing about fire. It consumes everything. Even the person who lit the match. Because while Jeanne's ships ruled the channel, her body wore thin. And behind every cheer in the village, behind every whispered prayer, there was something else. Exhaustion. You don't chase ghosts forever. And Jean, she had become one. Not in name and life. She didn't sleep. She didn't laugh. She kept sailing because stopping meant remembering. And remembering meant breaking. If this were a film, this is the scene you'd see. Late at night, Jeanne alone on deck. Wind snapping her cloak. She holds her husband's dagger not to use just to feel the weight of it. Her son older now watching from the shadows. Wanting to ask if they're done. Too afraid to hear the answer. Because when you live on revenge long enough, you forget what peace tastes like. And somewhere in Jean's eyes, that hunger had gone cold. They say she started sailing less, started docking more. The black paint on the ships faded. And for the first time in years, the sea fell silent. Some say the king finally struck a deal with her. Others say her body gave out before her sword did. But one thing is certain, the lioness didn't die screaming. She left her final message without a single word. She simply stopped. And for a woman who made silence bleed, that was louder than any war drum. The warships faded. The sea calmed. The lioness disappeared. But legends don't end when the sails drop. They echo. Because Jeanne de Clisson didn't just make enemies. She made questions. Where did she go? Why did she stop? And who, if anyone, dared to follow her? History, the official kind, doesn't tell us. She simply vanishes from the records. No death date, no grand funeral, not even a footnote with closure. Just silence. But not the kind that fades. The kind that lingers. Because long after the last black ship left the water, Jeanne's name still whispered through the French countryside. Not as a villain, not as a pirate, but as something harder to define, a woman who dared. And if this were a film, this is the montage scene. A seamstress in Bordeaux quietly stitches a lion into the lining of her dress. A fisherman near Nantes teaches his son to tie knots the old way like Jean's crew did. A young noblewoman reads a hidden letter smuggled, unsigned, that ends with one word. Courage. That was Jeannie's final act. Not revenge, not destruction, but example. She'd lived through fire and left behind the blueprint for defiance. And her son, he didn't inherit the fleet. He inherited the choice. Whether to stay in the ashes of his mother's war, or become something different. That's the power of stories like Jean's. They don't wrap up with bows. They don't end when the swords drop. They settle in the bones. They rattle behind closed doors. They make you ask, what would I have done if they nailed my love to a gate? If they silenced my name, would I stay quiet? That's the echo Jeanne left behind. And history, it still hasn't answered it. Long after the Black Fleet stopped sailing, one shadow still moved with purpose. Olivier, her son. He was no longer a boy watching ships burn. Now he was a man, and the world still broken, still sharp. But Olivier didn't carry his mother's rage. Not exactly. He carried the silence that came after. While the French court quietly erased her from their scrolls, Olivier carved his own place in stone, steel, and battle scars. They didn't call him a pirate. They called him Marshal of France. Yes, that France. The same kingdom that nailed his father's head to the gates. The same crown his mother hunted through storms. He served it, not out of loyalty, not out of peace, but because some legacies aren't fire, they're fuse. He knew exactly what his mother had done. He never spoke of it, never had to. But every decision he made in court and war echoed the woman who raised him. He refused cowardice. He bent to no nobleman's pride. And when enemies crossed him, they didn't just lose. They vanished. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about memory, about never letting them forget. Even the king had to admit Olivier de Clisson fought like someone who had already lost everything. And that kind of man, you don't control him. You just watch where he points his sword. Jeanne had shown the world what fury looked like. Her son showed them what it became when it learned to wait. He outlived kings. He commanded armies. He raised his own sons to know the smell of salt and iron. And through it all, he never wore the lion. But he didn't have to, because some emblems don't live on banners. They live in blood. Jeanne de Clisson never got a statue. No crown, no anthem. Not even a grave with her name carved bold. But here's the truth. No monarch wants in their archives. She never vanished, not really. Because women like Jeanne don't live in marble. They live in stories, in warnings whispered across seaports, in symbols painted on hidden shields. In the way a daughter learns to raise her chin and not ask permission. France tried to erase her. The church tried to silence her. But she'd already slipped beyond their reach. They couldn't bury what refused to kneel. And centuries later, something strange happened. People started asking about her. Not the kings, not the saints. Her. Not because she was gentle, but because she was furious and dared to survive anyway. In dusty libraries, her name resurfaced in margins. In old sailors' songs, a line would echo. Black sails, red flags, and fire in her heart. Every few generations, someone rediscovers her, usually when the world forgets what fury looks like in a woman's hands. And what's most remarkable, she never asked to be remembered. She didn't brand herself a legend, didn't pose for paintings, didn't leave behind manifestos or memoirs. She just acted and left history to chase her shadow. So when people say history is written by the victors, they're right mostly. But sometimes, it's haunted by the ones that tried to erase. And Jeanne de Clisson, she still sails not on water anymore, but in every girl who refuses to be quiet. In every mother who learns to lead through grief. In every story that dares to say, she did not ask for mercy, and she did not wait for permission. So maybe she was never meant to be remembered. Not in the way kings are remembered with coin statues and rewritten glory. He was just a child when the pain began, but it wasn't pain in the way most people understood it. It started with a simple fall. Baldwin had been wrestling with another boy roughhousing as boys do when his tutor noticed something strange. Baldwin didn't flinch when he scraped his arm on stone. He didn't yelp. He didn't cry. Didn't feel it at all. That was the first sign. The numbness. Not fear, not agony, just the absence of pain. It was the kind of thing only a trained eye would catch, and his tutor William of Tyre was that kind of man. He wrote about it later with the kind of careful dread only someone who had seen too much could manage. He didn't name the disease immediately, but in that moment, history changed. Because Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, heir to a throne son of the ruling class of Outremer, wasn't just a prince anymore. He was a boy with leprosy. And in the 12th century, that wasn't just a diagnosis. It was a death sentence delivered by God's own silence. But here's the thing, Baldwin didn't fold. He didn't weep in a chapel or vanish into sickbeds. He kept writing, kept learning. His bones ached, his skin cracked. Sometimes he bled in secret, but he never let it show. People would later say he was brave. But it wasn't bravery, not exactly. It was something colder, something sharper. It was awareness. A kind of clarity that most boys never have. Baldwin knew early that life wasn't going to carry him gently. So he didn't wait to be carried. He studied harder. He listened more. He learned how power works, how men circle around weakness like wolves. And he learned how to stop bleeding even when he couldn't feel the cut. The court didn't talk about it, not openly. No one dared name what was happening to the king's son. But behind every bowed head and reverent nod was one question whispered in stone halls and dark chambers. How long will he last? But Baldwin had already made up his mind. He wasn't going to last. He was going to rule. And that difference. That's where the real story begins. His hands betrayed him first. The fingers stiffened. The joints swelled. Some mornings he couldn't grip a quill without it trembling. Other days his robe clung to open sores along his back. Silent evidence that his skin had begun to rot faster than his legacy ever would. But his mind, that was another story entirely. While his flesh weakened, his intellect caught fire. It wasn't just that Baldwin was clever, it was that he was ruthless about being prepared. He devoured strategy the way others devoured gossip. Read until his eyes burned. Memorized maps dynasties' trade routes. He could debate philosophy in Latin 1 hour and predict troop movements the next. Even his enemies admitted it. He wasn't the kind of prince you kept around out of pity. He was the kind of prince who could outthink a council of grown men, and often did. They called him precocious, but that word barely scratched the surface. Precocious implies charm. Baldwin was steel behind silk, and he had to be, because while the nobles whispered behind his back, wondering how long his body would hold up, Baldwin was already drafting laws, reviewing grain levies, learning who smiled too quickly and who never blinked. He learned how to spot ambition before it turned into betrayal. A skill that would come in handy. More than once. Some envied his birthright, others pitied his disease, but most feared his clarity. He could look at a man once and know exactly what he wanted, and he never forgot it. One diplomat from Byzantium called him the boy who listens like a man with nothing to lose. That wasn't quite right. Baldwin had something to lose, everything. But that's what made him dangerous. He knew the kingdom didn't need a body that could march for miles. It needed a mind that never wavered. And in that quiet space between pain and precision, Baldwin ruled. No one saw the ulcers under his sleeves. No one heard the muffled groans when his joints locked during council meetings. No one knew that he practiced writing each morning with a hand that barely held shape. All they saw was a young king who never flinched, who answered war with reason, who reminded them with every decision that decay doesn't equal defeat. They crowned him young, just 13, too young to vote in most kingdoms. Old enough, apparently, to hold a throne. The coronation was held at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, Jerusalem's heart, echoing with incense gold and hollow reverence. The choir sang. Nobles bowed. The crown was set upon his head with trembling hands. They called it sacred, but Baldwin knew better. The crown wasn't holy, it was heavy. Heavy in a way that cracked something in his neck, and something deeper in his chest. They dressed him in white robes, ceremonial, spotless. But under the layers, his skin wept, silently bandaged tight where it had blistered the week before. No one spoke of it. No one dared. They spoke of divine right instead, of God's will, of legacy. And behind every long live, the king was the quiet, unspoken clause while he lasts. The court smiled for him, but watched him like a sunset beautiful, but clearly on its way down. Even his allies counted his reign in months, not years. Every handshake was a prelude, every blessing a eulogy in disguise. But Baldwin didn't blink. If they expected a ceremonial child, they were about to meet a strategist in a dying shell. He sat through hours of ritual with a spine of steel and lips that barely moved. He watched the bishops, the barons, the foreign envoys. He cataloged them like pieces on a chessboard, not with malice, but with cool understanding. Because Baldwin wasn't just trying to rule, he was trying to buy time. Time to secure peace. Time to push back against Saladin, time to outpace the rot in his own bones. And above all, time to find someone strong enough to take the kingdom when he no longer could. But that would prove harder than any war. The thing about thrones is that they're never empty for long. And Baldwin's crown, radiant as it looked, had already begun to scourge. Not just from the gold pressing into his skull, but from the weight of a kingdom held together by a boy king, with splintering fingers and no room left to fall. Maybe Jeanne de Clisson was meant for something else. To be felt, like salt in the air before a storm, like the silence before a scream. She didn't ask for legacy, she became one in spite of it all. Not because she won every battle in it, but because she chose not to vanish after losing everything. And the sea, it never gave her back. Because women like Jean don't return to shore. They become tide. They become wind. They become a name that still makes powerful men uneasy when spoken too loudly. So tonight, if the water feels a little colder, if the waves crash just a little harder, remember she's still out there.